Good morning. My name's Prue Sulicich and I am a life coach helping people achieve personal goals. I do this by working with people one-on-one, but also through my digital products. And I've got a digital product called the Finishers Club, where we achieve your first goal so you then can go on to achieve any goal that you set your mind to. And I also have my own podcast called More Life, Less Drama, which I drop episodes every week on a Friday.
Hello, I'm John Guturillo, the life coach of your listener and the host of the podcast of the same name. As a coach, I combine evidence-based strategies with a wealth of personal and professional experience to comprehensively help people to learn about their minds and make the changes they desire in life. In doing so, I work to combine the best aspects of traditional therapy and contemporary helping professions while addressing the limitations of both. And on my program, I discuss social science and critical thinking. Welcome to this collaboration between the Your Listener podcast and the More Life, Less Drama podcast. Today we'll be discussing the caveats of idealism when making choices in life and some of the factors that surround personal responsibility when making choices. As per usual, we'll disclaim that you should never take what you see on the internet as advice, so please take what you hear today as a set of perspectives. We're going to be discussing a range of ideas and critically analysing the strengths and weaknesses of each of them. We're hoping to open the conversation so that people can collaboratively learn about the world with us, but if you do have concerns about your own life, please seek professional advice, whether it be in the form of a life coach or another type of helping professional. Prue, I understand that one of the issues that you've addressed in your own work is that of idealism, and particularly some of the self-help mantras that can sometimes be somewhat misguided. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Firstly, I want to tell you what being an idealist is all about. It's like having this unrealistic belief that there is perfection out there and that there is one way and that's the only way. So that's where I'm coming from when I answer this question. Well, firstly, on a personal note, I am not an idealist. Absolutely not. I realise that there is no one thing that is the perfect thing. And I'm not sure why I've been like that. I've always been like that. I've just been able to look at things from a greater perspective and just know that there's lots of different things out there. But upon saying that, what I help a lot of people with is that they come and they're not achieving their goals, because when I'm thinking about this as well, I'm thinking about achieving goals and personal goals in life to feel better as being the main aim. And people come because they have this ideal of what perfection is and what life should look like, or they've been told life should look like, and it stops them from taking any sort of action. From my perspective, it's like I'm a person that's trying lots of different things all the time, knowing that there's not any right or wrong, but that's not the majority of people, is what I've found. Is that something that you've found as well, John, in your line of work?
I have found that it's something that tends to plague the human race somewhat. And your sense of ethics is really showing, Prue, because the fact that the moment at which somebody approaches you and has an ideal about what their life should be, but then is asking you for advice on how to potentially achieve that, this is where a lot of the problems in our professional field can actualize, because this is where a lot of the less honest folk start to sell unrealistic ideas.
I was just talking about this with a client this morning, okay? She is a mortgage broker, and we were talking about her business, and she said something like, I have a lot of self-doubt because that I can't get everybody a loan, and that makes me fearful for actually going out and, telling people that I can get people loans. She said, because there's so many people out in the world saying, I can get anybody any loan. And it's like, yeah, but that's just not the case. That's usually BS. And so the same is true in our industry as well, where they have this, we think there's a 5-step process to make $10,000 a month or to feel better or whatever. And the actual truth of the matter is there is no 5-step process anywhere that is going to fit every single person. And that's what we've been fed and we've been told. And so we think that we're doing something wrong when it's not working. And so as a coach, that's what we help people with, like unraveling the expectation that they have on themselves from the expectation that society has placed on us.
Indeed, and I can't speak for this particular 5-step process in and of itself. I'm not familiar with it intimately, but processes that are developed in this way in sales or in marketing or in other aspects of business, often they're used to simplify what is a very complex reality, which whenever we work in business, in marketing, we are dealing with human psychology. That's incredibly complex. We often try to simplify it. But as you'd know, there's no substitute for sound intuition and being able to actually use your sound qualitative judgment to make sometimes a single decision based on a lot of different information. Mm-hmm. And that is very much the case in decision making in our personal lives as well. Unfortunately, as you've commented on in the past, there is a lot of self-help rhetoric, and people will more than likely be familiar with it. It's often seen on social media and to the effect of, you need to believe in yourself. If you believe in yourself, everything will work out. If you love something, your passion will show through. If you don't have self-belief, then you'll never get anything done in life. You have to follow your dreams, otherwise you'll be miserable. Some people talk about manifesting, which is a quasi-spiritual or spiritual practice, which I don't want to get into too much into the minutiae of that right now, but it's part of the same lineage. There's a real problem with that.
Why isn't it, okay to have like the ideal and for everyone to go towards that? What's the problem?
To analyse this, we have to use the principle of parsimony. It's used in all forms of science, social science being the relevant one here. And parsimony says that in an ambiguous situation in which there are no guarantees or proven answers, proven being a mathematical concept in which something is either right or wrong, then the answer that you choose should be the one that has the fewest assumptions, that is to say, suppositions made without evidence. If we assume that something as relatively simple as self-love and following one's dreams is all that's needed to be successful, we're also assuming that there's some kind of universal mechanics on how life operates. There's some type of entity or force that basically ensures that a certain number of actions will lead to certain outcomes. Now, there are spiritual frameworks that actually posit that life is already planned before you take action, and that you can't actually choose what happens, that there's no free will, and that there are no accidents, so to speak, that everything that is going to happen regardless of what you do. I don't want to degrade people based on their beliefs. That's not what I'm about. But to eliminate all the assumptions that such a complex system actually exists, the most parsimonious conclusion really is there's actually no guarantees in life. And this is why what often happens is people do follow their dreams or their passions or whatever it is that they feel intuitively is right for them, but then they don't seek the success that they do. And I have to admit that was actually my early start. When I finished high school, I actually trained as a professional photographer. Maybe there is still a photography industry. I'm certainly not a careers coach, so if you're considering a career in photography, don't take my advice on face value, but I found it very difficult to make a living from that. And there are only a certain number of principles that you can follow to increase the likelihood that you'll achieve what you want. And that's how I found that being a helping professional both had a future in it, but it's something about which I'm incredibly passionate. It was a valuable lesson.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I have learned so many lessons. To me, for my own personal success, the older you get, you get better at deciding what the success looks like as well. And again, it's not having that ideal expectation of what success is, like X amount of money, X amount of time off, holidays, house, car, all that sort of stuff. You have to actually define it for yourself rather than letting society define it for you, or your parents define it for you, or your best friend, or your partner, or whatever. There was one thing that kept coming up in my mind, and it's the statement of there is no right decision. There's just the decision that you make right. That feels like a philosophy that I'm stepping into more and more, because we are so confused and so overwhelmed with information. I did a podcast recently. I talked about bits of information that was available to us, and it was like it's a massive amount of information, and it's like no wonder we're all confused. And the decision that I make today, in 5 months' time, it might not be the result that I want. So then I've got to make another decision, and it might be like a contrasting decision to the one that I made 5 months ago. And that's okay. And so I think that's what you and I are helping people with. It's like not making things a problem when we don't reach the expectations that we're, striving for, and it's taking longer than we wanted it to, because so many things take longer than we think they're going to take. Building a business is one of the things, and that's why there's only why most people are employed and not self-employed, because most people, building a business it's tough. It takes a lot of grit and tenacity and patience and persistence and all that sort of stuff. And we often, think that something's going to take longer because someone said, hey, you can earn $100,000, in X amount of time. Then you try it out, you're like, hold on, that's taken me 5 years to do that, not 1 year. I think you can apply that for all areas of life. Yeah, you get to make that decision for yourself. And if you are leaving it up to somebody else, chances are that it's not going to be for you. It's going to be for somebody else. And then the chances of you showing up to achieve whatever you want to achieve is less likely, because it doesn't align with who you are or who you want to be in the future.
You're absolutely right that when you define success, the human mind doesn't work well with vague goals. They have to be specific goals, and it has to be able to command action. So when something is forced on you, the likelihood is you won't process it as well. You're going to have a lot more questions than you're going to have answers. Whereas if you undertake all the process itself of defining your own goals, something about that intrinsic nature is going to help you achieve that you wouldn't have if it was set elsewhere.
Yeah, it's exactly what I do. I do in my course that I offer, right? It's the basics of that. And I'm also going to be contradictory because I have a 5-step process that literally, if you went to my sales page, I say 5 steps to achieving your goals. But when you come into the program, it is all about that intrinsic, what drives you forward. Let's figure out what actually drives you forward and eliminate all the other stuff. So then you do show up for the goals that you do want to achieve, that means something to you. And I love that I've come to that process, because it's been a long time in the making, thinking about my own life, because that's where we start. We think about how things work for ourselves, and especially as coaches, that's an important part of being a coach, I think, this really being able to figure things out for yourself first. And so you can then have the wisdom, I suppose, to impart and help your clients figure it out for themselves. I don't know what it is about human psychology that when someone tells us to do something that we really don't want to do it, even if it's good for us.
Quite possibly it's because when somebody imposes a demand on you, often it brings with it a fear of what the consequence or what the intended purpose is. You don't know why that person's demanded that. You don't know whether they yield something from you complying with it. It also depends a lot on culture. In Western culture, we are individualistic by and large, and so demands are more likely to be met with resistance or at least a questioning than in traditional cultures in which collectivism is the more likely framework.
And it is different for everybody. That's just from from my perspective, but there's other people that are very willing to be told what to do. Some people come to me and just want me to tell them what to do. And I'm like, yeah, that's not how it works. In life, there's lots of how-tos. This is how you do stuff. I suppose that's why we've gotten to that point, because people are just like, how do you do it? How do you do it? And really what the focus on, it's the why and the who, not the how.
Which is not to say that frameworks such as your 5-step process are not useful. In fact, often, as I said, they do help to make accessible the game of life, which is a complex matter in and of itself. But there's something that has to form the basis for all decisions that we make and for all our life. And there are certain universal truths that have to be applied in every situation. Otherwise, we're missing part of the problem. It's a therapeutic modality. It's a philosophy. I use it in my own work, but it should be applied in every aspect of daily life, and that is existentialism.
It is exactly actually what I use in my own coaching practice. And so it was interesting to see what that was about. Can you tell us what existentialism is about?
Existentialism essentially posits that there's nobody else in life who can make your decisions except yourself, and that we have free will, that we not only can but have to make choices for ourselves, and we also have to take responsibility for those choices. And the reason it's so important is that, as I said, the parsimonious conclusion on life is that there is no guarantees about what outcomes will result from choices. And so it's maladaptive or doesn't aid survival if somebody too rigidly follows a specific framework or a specific aspiration, to the extent that if it doesn't work, then they start to question the purpose of life itself, or they start to question the purpose of trying to pursue their own idea of success. The problem is there's really only two ways you can go. You can either analyze all your choices, understand the risks and benefits of each, and then decide to take the choices that are most useful to you, and the consequences of which you're happy to tolerate if the consequences actualize. Or you can avoid the choice because you fear failure. If you choose to take a risk in life, you may succeed or you may fail. If you choose not to take that risk because you're scared of failure, then the guarantee is that you'll fail. And there's nothing spiritual about that or philosophical. It's actually just objective reality, but that's just how the universe works.
Yeah, because some people are very adverse to making like risky decisions. I'm not one of these people. But I have that belief. It's like, that everything will just work out, and I'm always going to be okay no matter what. There's no right decision. It's just, you just show up and make it right. Yeah, when I was starting to look at all this existential therapy stuff, and I actually created a list. The first point is every human being is capable of self-awareness. Yep, tick, absolutely. People don't know that though. Like, I feel I spend a lot of my time teaching people how to be self-aware because they don't realize they've got that ability. Every human being has free will and is responsible for their free choices. Yes, which means taking the consequences as well. And a lot of people also have problems with that. They always seek to blame outside things rather than just going, oh yeah, that was a decision that I made. So much easier when you do that, by the way, for people that are listening. It takes so much less effort to be like, oh, okay, like that was me. It's totally okay. We can move on. The next point was every human being is unique and can only be understood through interpersonal relationships with others. The next point is every human being is constantly being reborn and recreated. And some people are so scared to take that first step of change because they think they're not going to be able to handle it. But the truth of the matter is, I just didn't change overnight. It's just like this slow, steady change. The next point is meaning is constantly changing and no one can fully comprehend the meaning of their life because it is always changing. The whole point of trying to find the meaning of life, it's a pointless exercise because it's always changing. And then every human being experiences anxiety as part of the human experience. A lot of people set goals to feel better and to relieve or eliminate negative emotions. And I just want to say to everybody, that is not the point of setting goals or doing self-development or anything. I totally believe that life is 50-50, that you have both negative and positive. Like, we name them like that, but they're just emotions. They're not neither negative nor positive. They're just emotions. And when people spend so long and so much time trying to eliminate them from their life, they're focusing on the wrong thing. And the last one is death is inevitable and gives life meaning. If we didn't have the end of death, what would anything mean? Like, we just what's the point? So I loved those points. Like, would you agree with all those points?
I personally don't use all of them in practice. I'd say one of the points with which I disagree on in this particular field is that I'd say that a person can be understood by more than just their relationships with others, even though we are social animals and we most likely have to have those relationships in order to be psychologically healthy. So it's certainly relevant. I'm not sure if I agree with the entire concept of that, but one of the ideas that I would challenge is that there's no such thing inherently as meaning in life. I think assigning meaning to life, it can lack parsimony because, again, for life to have meaning, it suggests that there's some set of mechanics that creates an intention for life to operate a certain way. Whereas I would actually challenge people the other day. I would say, if life is a blank slate and has no meaning, through existentialism, you have two choices. You can either choose to make your life meaningful, or you can choose not to. But searching for meaning is a superfluous and rather futile goal because, again, meaning implies there is intentionality, and the only intentionality can be through your own actions.
So is meaning and purpose different?
This is one of those questions that we may never be able to answer, but it depends on how you define them. I would argue, though, that regardless of whether they're the same or whether they're different, the key point is to ensure that the individual understands that the only virtue that can be created in life is through your own intentional actions. That if you seek something externally, you're more likely to be disappointed if it doesn't work or if it doesn't meet your expectations. And you're less likely to be motivated to also put effort into your life. Whereas if you assume that you are completely responsible for creating meaning or purpose or virtue in your life, then you're more likely to take on the responsibility of taking all the actions that are necessary to actually make yourself feel as though there is a virtue in your life or a purpose or a meaning.
I think this is good for people to hear because so much weight is put on those two topics. Maybe it's just not as deep as we want it to be sometimes. Yeah.
I'm also curious about what you said about your own risk tolerance. You mentioned that your intuition is always that if you show up and do your best, that things will work out. And I'm wondering if the way your mind conceptualizes that personally is different to how you verbalize it, because to be successful, obviously, you have to have risk awareness. I'm wondering if underlying that attitude in you is a determination to deal with the consequences if they're undesirable, rather than just thinking that there are no undesirable consequences possible, but actually that you're willing to deal with consequences if they're not what you want them to be.
Yeah. No, good distinction, because I think I'm definitely the second distinction. That I know there are going to be consequences and it's like being okay with them. I would call it being optimistic, always optimistic about things. As I've gotten older, my risk tolerance has increased, but also my tolerance for the consequences has increased as well. Not so worried about what people think, and because we really try to control that a lot, and it's like we just want to be perceived as good and like that we're doing great things and that we're confident and all that sort of stuff. But it doesn't mean that you don't feel a lot of negative emotions along the way, but you learn to process those negative emotions differently than just making. Because back in the day, I would just stop. I wouldn't proceed any further because there's like, a bit of pushback. Oh no, stop. I'll just go back to the way I was or being perceived.
I tend to be quite measured, but I think one of the tenets of risk tolerance, which I think is one of my personal strengths, is being able to discern worthwhile risks from risks that aren't so worthwhile. It's about being able to discern what the likely benefits can be if you take the risk and whether it's likely to actually yield a worthwhile and satisfactory return. One of the risks that I take on a daily basis, now that you mention it, is being authentic as a helping professional. Even in 2024, mental health professionals still try to quite often create an air of separation from their clients, in which it's almost as though they have a very strong veil over them and their professional self is extremely rigid. And I wanted to try to attenuate that presence, because I was seeing the association between that attitude and outcomes, both in my own life, and I've seen many psychotherapists over the years, but in the lives of my clients back when I was a social worker, and even some of my present clients who have sought my services as an alternative to traditional psychotherapy. And I decided that it wasn't just in other people's best interest that I was authentic, but it was in my own best interest as well. Other people's best interest, because they're not seeing a false sense of who I am, they're seeing a human being who has his own flaws, his own virtues, his own journey. And I found it was important in my own healing journey as well to finally say, I'm not ashamed to be mentally ill, and I can choose to take other constructive risks in life just with the attitude that I'm not going to make the same mistakes again. And
Absolutely.
even on my podcast, being able to talk to people who may have different perspectives from me and talk about important issues, at the risk that they're going to be upsetting conversations, because whenever you talk about something important, there's going to be a risk that someone disagrees with you. But I take that risk because I think it's worthwhile. I think that in order to make any constructive change or to teach anyone anything, you have to be willing to take that risk.
I love that you mentioned how the traditional psychotherapist keeps their real self, separate from their professional self. I speak with a lot of people about this when they're looking into new careers. A lot of people that have worked for me have been inspired to become a coach themselves. And this is a big topic of discussion amongst coaches and therapists and all that sort of stuff. Again, it's why I chose life coaching over traditional therapy, because I feel the biggest gift that I can give people is my authentic self, that people see me as a real human that has real emotions, and I can use my own experience to show them how it's possible. Like, I love being an example of what's possible. 10 years ago, I could not even speak hardly to anybody. I was super quiet. I was so nervous and just had so much self-doubt, I suppose. I didn't know how to use my voice for anything. So I was like just following the crowd most of the time and following whatever society said that I should be doing. And so stepping into this, it's really empowered me. So it's like, it feels like my duty to empower others. And I do that through my own story. Not all the time. It's starting to ease off a little bit more now because I have more understanding of what people need from me. I'm not using my story as much, but I still get to connect with people on that level, which is, I think, anytime I get some sort of testimonial, that's something that is always said in that testimonial. Prue's real. She understands me. She's, has similar experiences, and she shares her experiences, which I think it's great. It's really important, that human connection part of it. It's really important.
I would argue that authenticity is something that all helping professionals could definitely benefit from.
It's not an easy thing to do, but from a human connection point of view, that's a really, really important part to do. And it's only through conversation and higher level, like critical thinking, that you get to that point. It's usually not going to be found sitting around the dining table with your family talking about the same things, doing the same things as people. That's not where it's found usually, because usually that's where you learn all the social behavior that you've got right now that might be holding you back from your authenticity. So yeah, it's important to really seek people out that have got it's not particular. We're as somebody that's a coach, we're not telling you what to do, but we go digging, right? We dig for the gold, and we hear things that people say, and they're like, then we dig into that thing, and they're like, I didn't even realize I had that belief, but here it is, just through conversation.
And this is where that idea of making right and wrong decisions, and there not being wrong decisions or right decisions, but only making decisions the right way, comes into play. And I would actually argue that there are such things as wrong decisions and right decisions. It's just that there's a large spectrum of different correct decisions that you can make, and all have their nuances and their strengths and weaknesses. And then there are some decisions that you just shouldn't make, especially if you know the decision is going to have a horrible outcome and no benefit. Then of course that's a decision you should never make, but that's reductionist somewhat. There are some principles that people can follow if they want to be successful in their own way. And regardless of what you personally define as success, then there's always some principles in common. What would you say are some of the principles that you teach when helping people find their own personal success, including in the 5-step system that you sometimes use?
Yeah. The principles are, it always goes back to the awareness first. That's the thing that I teach the most, how to be aware of your own thinking. I believe, and the principle is that how you think always ends up in the results that you have in life. Thinking creates feelings, which feelings then drive action or inaction, and your action or inaction gives you the results that you want in life. So that's really the model that I love to use, with the top part being circumstances are completely neutral. Anything that's happening in the world, it's only given a feeling about it when you think a particular way about it. And I actually love that. That has changed my life personally, But for people that I've worked with, that alone of circumstances are neutral has created such an impact for so many people, because it takes the pressure off the circumstances, because some of the circumstances are outside of your control. So when you're trying to control the circumstance and you think it's all ending up not how you want it to end up, you feel like you're helpless. And so teaching people how to neutralize circumstances and create them just as the factual things of life, and then saying to them, now you get to choose, like this is the critical thinking part where you get to choose now what you want to think about that particular circumstance, because you always have a choice, like always. I know there's certain ways that we have been taught to think about certain circumstances, but my belief is that you get to choose however you think about it. And it is the hardest part of my practice, teaching people how to choose new thoughts, because no one's been taught this. And so that I do, that's the philosophy that I stick with all the time. Circumstances are neutral. And it's obviously not new. It's not even the person that I taught off of. It's not new to her either. Like no one's actually, put their stamp on this and said, this is mine. But then part of my 5-step process for achieving goals all goes into the action line. Choose what you want first. Eliminate what you don't want. Figure out how to problem solve in advance, because we actually are capable of problem solving in advance, which sort of goes back to that critical decision making about, if you thought about it in advance and said, hey, this is going to be the consequence of that, do you still want to do it? You'd be like, yay or nay. And so it has you showing up in sort of like a bit more of a process that is not confusing, that every time that you want to achieve a goal, you're like, this is what I've got to do first to set the foundations really well. And once I get that, the nuance is in the action line, because you've got to change your actions all the time to get to the result, because not one thing, creates the same result. So you've got to keep trying and testing and being flexible enough, I suppose, to just understand what that looks like and, go from there. So that's my philosophy, I suppose, that I use.
So for me, it's not as much of a process as it is a set of principles that apply to essentially any decision-making process. And when I'm working with a client, the likelihood is that we will develop a process that's individual to that particular client, and they do have some elements in common, but there are a set of principles that are essentially universally applicable. The first action that I would argue needs to be taken is for people to identify their own virtues, that is to say, their skills, and also what their limitations are, because there's no shame in having limitations, and it makes no sense to try to pursue something if you believe it's going to be beyond your limits. There you have a choice to either try to change your limits, or if you don't believe you can change your limits, then choose an alternative goal that is going to respect your limits. And also what's personally meaningful to you. If you're good at something and it's personally meaningful to you, and you feel that you can carve a unique place for yourself in the world pursuing that goal, then you're more likely to be motivated in the long term to continue pursuing it. You also need to find opportunity, which is to say, investigating whether the likelihood of you achieving that goal is sufficient for you to justify pursuing it. So this often applies in employment or in starting a business, but it can apply in many other facets of life as well. And sometimes, unfortunately, there just aren't enough resources, financial or otherwise. There may not be enough work for a particular job that you may want to pursue. So you have to identify what your skills are, what the opportunity is, and then where your skills match the opportunity. And you have to believe in yourself, but here's the real mechanics of it, and you've defined this really well. I'd like to expand on the reciprocal nature of it, but when people talk about self-belief and dreams, these are the mechanics that they actually don't explain to you, which is actually quite frightening considering how often people do it. Evolutionarily, your body and your mind send you signals, right? And the environment also is interpreted by your mind as a signal in some way. And your thoughts, your feelings, your actions, and the environment, which includes the people with whom you associate in a given situation, all have a reciprocal effect on each other. that has an evolutionary basis, right? Because in order to survive in the world, you have to interpret information from the environment correctly. If it's a risk, you have to be able to identify it. And then you have to be ready to take action to use that information in such a way that it's going to help you avoid coming to harm. The problem is that sometimes we misinterpret information, or we interpret information in a way that's not necessarily an objective misinterpretation, but it's not the most healthy or constructive way to interpret it, which is where I would diverge slightly and say that circumstances are, I would argue they're not necessarily inherently neutral, but you can choose different interpretations of them. And even though sometimes the interpretation you make isn't objectively the most truthful or the most rational, the fact is that humans are interpreters. We interpret information, and we ultimately have to make interpretations. Like, our mind is never going to stop doing that. So we have to work with the interpretations we make. And so if we don't believe in ourselves, the problem is that lack of an assuring thought is going to turn into a self-deprecating or a self-defeating feeling. And if we feel self-deprecating, the likelihood is that without us even realizing it, it's completely inadvertent, we often don't realize it, our actions are actually going to be less than optimal. So even if we choose to pursue the goal, if we don't feel optimally about it, the likelihood is that the neurology of how we're putting in the effort is going to be different than if we were actually self-assuring. And so if we're self-defeating and we don't perform as well because we're self-defeating, the feedback we get from the environment is not going to be reassuring. We won't perform as well on that task. We won't perform as well in that goal. The feedback we receive is, I'm not good at this. I was right all along. It reinforces the belief, and it continues from there. And it's not imaginary. The problem is that often how your thoughts and feelings influence you is completely inadvertent. You often don't realize it. So this is where the existential philosophy really comes into play, because even if the situation is bleak and the choice of, and even if there's a risk of failure, ultimately you have the choice about what actions you take to try to facilitate your success. You can't eliminate the risk of failure. You can't eliminate the setbacks sometimes. They happen. No matter how much effort you put in, there's always a risk of that happening. Ultimately, what you have to do is be determined to deal with the consequences in a way that's going to allow you to continue if you believe that the goal is worth pursuing. And there are several principles that apply to that universally. I would say that careful evaluation of consequences at every step of the process is important. So every time you come to a point at which you have to make a decision, research the benefits, and if you don't have this information available, find it, research it. Research the benefits, research the risks, and then decide, what risk am I willing to take here? Are the benefits worth it? Am I likely to get a reasonable outcome? Am I willing to tolerate it if the risks actualize and I have to deal with the consequences? Am I personally willing to be accountable for it? And then you have to be humble as well and say, if the risks are greater than the benefits and the risk of loss is too high, sometimes you should cut your losses and move on to a different goal. Doesn't mean you should give up trying, but move on to a different goal. Don't subscribe to the sunk cost fallacy in which you believe that just because you've put in a certain amount of effort that you should continue, even if the risk is evidently quite large that you're going to fail.
Like, I teach this concept of failing fast, and that's all part of that process. That's something I've learned along the way as well, because I've never been a process person. Like, I've had to teach myself how to be a process person. And it pays off to actually spend time doing that, because you get to make great decisions based on thinking, like, and looking into the future. And, like, again, you don't really know, like, you're just taking an educated guess about anything, but at least you've spent time thinking about the future, which I love thinking about the future, and I think that's going to be a helpful process for me to put in place as well.
Something else that people need to realise, and again, it's not an absolute, because some people in certain situations are going to be more likely to succeed than others. Millionaires could have just as easily failed as they did succeed, because the goals that have the higher chance of reward also have the higher risks. So often people have a lot of assistance, and sometimes when you've reached a certain level of success, it self-perpetuates, like in investment markets, for example. I'm certainly not a financial expert, but I understand that's how it can work. But when you're in those types of pursuits, the risk of failure is high, and every dollar counts. And that's why really people need to realize everybody is sitting on a razor's edge in some way, and you could just as easily tip one way or the other. And no matter what the self-help rhetoric says, there's actually no avoiding it. That's one of the scariest thoughts in life, and it's one of the things that we help people overcome in existentialism is how do you sit with the risk of failure without you letting it stop you from taking worthwhile action? And that's something that is relevant to any type of person, whether it's someone who just wants to improve their performance in one area of their life, all the way to someone who has a serious mental illness and is trying to change their behaviors or their thoughts or feelings for the better. Now, one of the byproducts of living life is internalization and externalization. To internalize in this circumstance is to take responsibility for a particular matter, whether it be accepting that you were the cause of the event, or if not accepting that you were the cause of the event, even if you weren't, accepting the task of trying to do the best you can in that circumstance. Externalizing is the opposite, placing that responsibility on an external factor or an external entity. Have you found that this is relevant in your work?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, internalizing and externalizing. It's like a tightrope, because there's some practices that always say, like, always turn it back on yourself. It's always you and your responsibility. And part of that, like, I get it. Like, I understand that concept of that. Like, it's really important to take responsibility for the results that you have in life. Like, and I fully support that. I do. Then there's these little, like, parts in life where you're like, I just refuse to take responsibility for that. There's been times in my life where it's like, yeah, this is really sucky. And, say if it's a relationship thing, it's like, I'm half of this relationship. And I've said this out loud. It's like, you know what? And I refuse to take responsibility for that. And I think that's okay to do that. And so it can't be just a black or white thing. Like, I actually think it could be dangerous if you did blame yourself all the time for everything, because I don't like that concept as a whole. Like, I always think there's nuances, I suppose. I've told this story in my podcast before about how there was one thing that happened in my childhood about putting myself in, like, social groups and being blamed just for being in a social group for a situation. And it never sat well with me. And I remember my dad telling me off about this particular thing. And he's like, well, you're just guilty by association, that type of stuff. And I was like, that to me, it's like, you could turn it around and be like, okay, yeah, I am. Like, I'm choosing to hang out with these people and all that sort of stuff. There's all different circumstances in life where maybe there's not a lot of opportunity to hang out with different people. And so you choose to hang around, and something that a group of people did that you weren't involved in, but you got in trouble for, it's like, no, I can't say it's always on me. So just things like that. I think there's little nuances in every single circumstance that, gives you the opportunity to do either. And again, it's back to your choice about how that sits well with you and, what your values are and all that type of stuff.
You're right. It is a tightrope, and there's a lot of ambiguity in the world. The detail comes in how you conceptualize the responsibility and how you deliver it. Again, there are certain universal truths that I'm not sure if they're taught in existentialism, but they need to be taught in and of themselves, that you always have more control over yourself than you have over other people.
Yes.
And the problem is that regardless of what choice you take, whether to take action yourself because you feel responsible for a situation, or choose not to take action because you don't feel responsible, whatever choice you make is going to have risks and benefits. And so you have to choose what benefits you'd like to achieve and what risks you're willing to take. Both have their extremities, and I've seen both of them actualize. I've worked in the past with, and continue to in some extent, with clients who have suffered trauma. And one of the key symptoms of trauma is internalizing responsibility for events that were not their fault. And people who are traumatized often do blame themselves for what happened, even if it wasn't their fault. People with other forms of mental illness can also exhibit a similar signs, similar symptoms. If you take responsibility for everything, if it's done in a self-blaming way, there's a good chance your mental health will decline as a result of it, because you're teaching yourself that no matter what you do in life, you're always going to be deserving of some type of negative value judgment. Even if you're someone who doesn't self-blame and takes responsibility rather than blame, in other words, accepting that you weren't to blame for certain situations, but you're going to choose to try to rectify them anyway because you just would rather the outcome be positive and you believe that you're more likely to achieve a positive outcome if you take responsibility than letting someone else. That can be constructive, because if you choose to take action, even if something's not your fault, you can still increase the likelihood of a positive outcome if you genuinely are capable of contributing to a positive outcome in that situation. The problem is that costs you time, that costs you resources, and it costs you energy. So again, the existential attitude is, where are my boundaries? You should always take responsibility when something is your fault, but in the realms of what isn't your fault, what responsibility am I willing to take, and in what circumstances is it only justified that I say it's not reasonable for me to spend these resources rectifying the situation when somebody else should have? Well, Prue, this has been a fantastic and insightful discussion. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you about these topics.
Absolutely. It's been a great discussion, and we come at things from different angles, but also the same. So I'm hoping that everybody's listening and can, just step into a new level of thinking.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us today. As per usual, if you have concerns about your own life, please seek professional help, whether it be through a life coach or otherwise. And if you have a topic that you'd like discussed, or you feel you'd like to potentially be a guest, contact us. We'd be happy to hear from you. We're always happy to hear from our listeners. So thank you for joining us, and in the meantime, take care.
Thank you. Bye.